everyone. How are we tonight? Hey, at least you're awake. That's a good start. Getting up? Is that better? Yay. So, good evening. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Conference Centre. My name's Rob Turnbull. I'm the Sustainability Manager here at the EICC. I help to organise these events because they're part of a free public talks which sits within a broader sustainability programme. This evening is part of EICC's commitment to community, to bring people together, share knowledge, and to spark meaningful conversations. This is part of the EICC's overall vision to create an environment which inspires ideas that change the world. Over the years, we've welcomed many speakers covering a wide range of topics. In fact, if you want to view any of those, they're actually on our YouTube channel, so feel free to go and watch any of the past ones. We've got plenty more coming up as well this year. We've plenty planned in. If you'd like to see what they are, just look on the What's On page or sign up to the newsletter, and you'll get notified whenever we arrange the next one. In fact, we've actually got one next week as well with Dr. May East looking at what if women designed the city. So that looks like it's going to be an interesting talk on urban development. But tonight, we're here in collaboration with the David Hume Institute, and we're delighted to welcome Professor Tim Jackson and Dr. Sarah Ivory. Professor Tim Jackson is I'm trying to try and say this in one go, ecological economist and writer. He has worked with the UK government, United Nations, European Commission, numerous NGOs, private companies and foundations to bring economic and social science research into sustainability. One go. This evening, he's sharing insights with his book, The Care Economy, with Dr. Sarah Ivory, who is the former senior lecturer in climate change and business strategy at the University of Edinburgh Business School, so I'm sure they'll have lots to talk about. That'll be followed by a Q&A, where you can ask your questions and join the conversation as well. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. There are no planned fire alarms tonight, so if the fire alarm does go off, please go through the exits, exit the building quietly and promptly. Also, tonight is being filmed, so just be aware of that. Now, without further ado, I'd just like to welcome to the stage Professor Tim Jackson and Dr. Sarah Ivory.
Hi, Tim.
Hey, Sarah.
How are you?
Again.
Here we are again. This is the
nice
second time, I think, I've interviewed you. The previous one was at the Jeffy Conference, Global Ethical Finance Conference, earlier this year. This one is about the care economy, available for purchase outside, you'll all know. I don't get a cut, but, you know, I'm willing to hawk it anyway. This comes after a few other books you've written. Oh, sorry, before I start with Tim, I'd love to welcome the audience. Do I see a few of my former colleagues here? I see at least one. Two. I think I saw a former student, did I? Not admitting it. That's either good or bad. I think these sort of public lectures, free public lectures, are so important, and that I'd like to thank the David Hume for bringing Tim up to Edinburgh to talk to us today about these complex issues, because they are complex. And there will be a copious amount of time for Q&A. However, anyone who knows me knows that I have Q&A rules. The rule is the Q is very important. There has to be a question, not 5 minutes of backstory, not 5 minutes of why you've thought of the question, and it has to have a question mark at the end, okay? Because we don't have a ton of time with Tim, and there's so many things people want to know. So please, as I come to you at the end and ask for questions, if you talk too long, I'm going to cut you off. And that student who I think is here will say that I can do that, okay? So have your question ready. I hope I haven't scared you. Tim, you started... I know, well, yeah, you better be ready as well.
You cut me off as well?
I do, definitely.
Okay, looking forward to it.
You started your book writing career, as it were, with the first one I read, which was Prosperity Without Growth. I think there was another one, The Material.
Material Concerns was the first one,
okay.
yeah.
Then you read Prosperity Without Growth, and then Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. But then you've moved on to the care economy. And before we get into that book, I wonder if you could talk about what made you move into care as a concept after the growth focus.
Well, a couple of things, really. I mean, the care concept was there, actually, even in Prosperity Without Growth. So a lot of people, when Prosperity Without Growth was published, focused on the without growth bits of it. But there was quite an important word before that, which was prosperity. And so when you ask what prosperity means, and I did in the book, one of the things that comes up first and foremost when you ask people what it means to do well in their lives is health. And so if you're thinking about health as the output of the economy, then you could very well ask, well, what should the economy be doing? And one of the things it should be doing, obviously, is caring, because that's what gives us and brings us health. And so it was right back there in Prosperity Without Growth. And towards the end of the book, I began to talk about what a friend described to me as something which you might call the Cinderella economy, a kind of economy that's left at home cleaning up the ashes while Cinderella goes, no, the two ugly stepsisters, how's it go? They go off to the ball. And Cinderella's, sweeping ashes by the fire. And he called it the Cinderella economy because essentially those sectors that I was describing were around care and craft and creativity, things that are incredibly important tasks in society, incredibly important sectors of the economy, incredibly important things to do if you want to have prosperity. And yet they're kind of seen as second and third class citizens in society. So that concept was there, I would say, right back in Prosperity Without Growth. And then in post-growth, I began to think a bit more about what health is, and this idea that actually health is a kind of balance. Mm-hmm. In fact, in physiological terms, health is almost always about balance. And then it suddenly occurred to me that actually, when you're trying to keep something in balance, having something that wants to grow and grow the whole time throws you continually out of balance. And so I began to find that the care economy was a way of talking about the prosperity that you might get when you let go of growth and what that would look like. And in particular, this idea that, a growth-based capitalism, it doesn't see a point of balance. It's constantly thinking in terms of more. More and more is always better and better, so we're always growing, we're always looking for more. And that the problem with that, the two problems with that, one is that, you don't recognize that point of balance quite often. And the other is that even if you could recognize it as a point of balance, you can't stop because you're too busy growing. And that became really the sort of foundation for the care economy, which has two very simple precepts, that prosperity is better thought of as health than as wealth, and that in consequence, the economy should focus more on care than on growth. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much it. Prosperity is health, economy is care.
But at the very start of the book, you kind of make a point of saying it's not the care economy so much as the economy of care. Mm. Why do you make that distinction?
Well, economy as care, because essentially that's what I'm doing. I'm sort of contrasting a principle. So our principle, if you could call it a principle, in the way that we organize our economy, is that it should grow and grow and grow, and that will give us more and more and more, and therefore we'll be better off. That's the kind of, that's the logic of it. And when it works, and it sometimes does work, then that's quite a good thing. But after a certain point, it stops working. And that's the point at which actually you've missed out on this idea of health. You've missed out on this idea of balance. And so you actually need a different principle. You need a different kind of organizing principle in order to think about what your economy is doing if it's about balance rather than just about having more and more. And it seemed to me, and it took me quite a long time to get there, but it seemed to me that care is actually that principle. Care, it seems to me, is like a central organizing principle for life itself. And it's not enough just to sort of say that and say, well, it's a good thing and we've got to care. In fact, it's slightly problematic to say that care is unassailably good. Let me try and explain that, because it seems counterintuitive. But it seems counterintuitive because care is always regarded within our modern use of the term as sort of unassailably good. If you care, you show that you love people. If you're not being selfish, you're being altruistic, you're looking after other people, you're looking for other people. It's a kind of it sets up a kind of moral high ground. And the problem is that as soon as something becomes morally unassailable, it becomes analytically useless. What do we mean then actually by care? And it can be misused. You can find that people use the terminology of care. I care for my kids by feeding them sweets all day long. because it's what they want. Or I care for my patients as a doctor by prescribing opioid painkillers, which I know they're going to get addicted to. Is that really what we mean by care? Or I care for my political friends by sending them bombs to drop on the children of their enemies. Is that care? You know, that's that usage, that unassailably moral good usage of care becomes a kind of, we're looking for the moral high ground the whole time, and we can use that word in ways that don't really have anything to do with health. They don't have anything to do with balance.
My sense as well was that there's this difference between care that you give versus care that someone has or receives. And I guess the point I'm making here is that we often think about the agency issue in care. And so a doctor cares for a patient, whereas where is the patient caring for themselves? And so it comes to a point I want to make later about what health is and the issue of social and psychological well-being. Because the best care you may give to someone is not caring for them at all, but allowing them to work out how to care for themselves.
Yeah, and I think the point is that in order to figure out why that's care, you need to have a better sense of what care is, in a way. And you've talked about, I mean, in that question, you've raised 2 or 3 really important issues, that distinction between caring for others and self-care, for example. And self-care is another of those places that can go actually quite a long way off the rails if you allow it to. Let me give you an example of that. So, you know, if care has to be care for the self, then I care for my reputation. In order to care for my reputation, I'm going to care for my status. In order to care for my status, I want to be as rich as possible, as powerful as possible, and I want to dump on my enemies all around me. And very soon, that sense of care for self, if it's prosecuted through status and reputation and dominion and power and territory, very soon leads us into war and to conflict. And that would seem to be the very antithesis of anything to do with health. And so I was kind of, you know, these were the sort of things I was sort of wrestling with a little bit when I was trying to find, when I was looking for a concept that we could say, this is an organizing principle, this is the principle, and this is how it relates to health. And if we can use that principle, we can then distinguish between something which calls itself care but is actually very destructive, and something that calls itself care and is genuinely in line with what it means to be healthy, to maintain health.
So let's come to health then, and then I want to come back to a couple of the other points. You talk about the idea of health as an asset and care as an investment, not a cost. I wonder if you could explore that and perhaps some ideas about how that idea could become universal, given it's not currently. Yeah.
No, it isn't currently, but it actually has quite a long pedigree, that idea. So health, if we think about health as something that you buy and sell, then it's a kind of commodity. But if you think about health as something that you store up, then you can think of it much more in terms of a kind of asset. It's something that is a stock of well-being that you can live from, you can draw from, that you can become, you can live well from, you can have a sense of when you're healthy, you have a sense of vitality, and that vitality takes you out into the world in all sorts of ways where you can do massively interesting things and wonderful things. And yet, if you don't look after that investment, that asset, like any investment, it just kind of crumbles and falls apart. And so this is the sense in which you need to be able to, you need to have a concept which says, well, I can reinvest in that. I can maintain that asset. I can restore it to its good condition. What is that thing that brings you to restoring health to its good condition? It's a meaningful concept of care. And I must point out to you, we haven't quite come to what I mean by this meaningful concept of care, this operational principle of care. So it's quite important that we get to that. But one of the things that you can think of this care as is a way of maintaining an asset. So you've got a house, right? And the house is getting older, and as it gets older, the windows fall apart, and the paint peels off, and the ceilings weaken, and you have to look after the cracks, and you have to put some time and effort into that house. Otherwise, it's going to be rubble. It's going to fall to dust. And I think you can think of health in that same sort of way. And the investment that you put into it is then the care. So you're maintaining the house, you're restoring the house, you're looking after the house, you're doing the painting, you're rebuilding the wall that's fallen down. You're doing the things that maintain the health of the house. And it's useful for a couple of reasons. One is because it gives us a metaphorical way of approaching what care is in relation to our own health. And the second is it makes it clear that in society, if we want to maintain the health of the population, we have to invest in that maintenance. And that maintenance is care. And so care is an investment. And why that becomes important in, this is very prosaic, but in fiscal terms, in accounting terms, is because governments treat investment expenditures and companies treat investment expenditures different from they treat current expenditures. So a current expenditure, you blow the expenditure, it's here today, it's gone tomorrow, and you don't think about it. In investment expenditure, it goes into the structure of your buildings, into your institutions, it goes into your houses, into your homes, into the government buildings. The investment is a way of creating something for the future. It's a commitment to the future. And really what I'm saying when I say care is that investment is to say we should treat it differently financially. We should not even regard it just as a current expenditure flow in fiscal terms. We should regard it as an investment expenditure. And to get to the sort of accounting nuts and bolts of that, that means that you would amortize that expenditure over the life of its investment, if you were thinking about it in technical terms. And that would mean also that governments would be much more able and indeed willing to spend into a care system through deficit spending, because you can afford to deficit spend when you're making an investment in a way that you can't afford to deficit spend when you're just making a current investment. So if you think about care as an investment, you've got both this metaphorical picture of looking after the house that you're living in and stopping it falling down, but you've also got a way to think about refinancing that activity within the economy.
So did we get to the focus of the care issue that you want to get to, or would you like to do that?
Yeah, let me do that. Let me do that. I mean, you're sort of seeing what I hope I may have led you in. Well, I don't hope I've led you into the same confusion that I had with it, but I do hope that I've kind of given you a sense in which when you approach a concept like care, it's not as straightforward as you might want it to be, partly because of this moral high ground issue, but also because there's lots of things going on. We use the language in lots of different sorts of ways. And so I was in a particular kind of mess with this. I'd read, lots of really good stuff written about care. And I'd also read a book called The Philosophy of Care by a guy called Boris Groys, who approaches care in a way that I felt was leading me very much into that danger of, the erosion between care and self-care. I'll come back to what self-care possibly should mean later on, but that erosion, if care includes self-care, and self-care includes my reputation includes my status includes power, money, the ability to dominate other people, and eventually leads to conflict and violence, what have we got left? Essentially, the care economy basically becomes the growth-based economy with a philosophical justification of all the violence that's involved in it. And I felt as though I reached a point where I kind of thought, I've lost it. I've lost the book. I can't even write this book anymore. And it happened coincidentally at a time when I sat down to write the book at the aftermath of the pandemic, when we were thinking a bit more about health and a bit more about care. And it seemed
to care a bit.
We did seem to care. We even applauded the carers on our doorsteps. And this seemed to be, a time in which was very receptive to the idea of the care economy. And then on the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we were suddenly in a very, very different world. And that got worse later in that year with what happened in Israel and Gaza, and it got worse in the 2 subsequent years. And so the world that I started writing the book in became a very, very different kind of world. And it really began to bother me that, first of all, that what I had thought I was writing about, a different kind of way of thinking about the economy, we were suddenly in a world which was careering towards violence, careering towards the opposite of care in any meaningful sense of the term. And then come across Boris Groys, who told me, well, if you take care as self-care, and self-care is status, and status is reputation, and reputation is power, power is military might, then all of a sudden I was kind of collapsing the difference. And it seemed as though that idea of thinking about the care economy, which I had wanted to be a kind of antidote to the growth economy, an antidote to the violence of the growth economy, actually was collapsing around me. And then in the middle of this confusion, when I was writing about the book, I was sitting on a beach in Pembrokeshire in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, I should say, which is a cold thing to do, so I can't guarantee the quality of the neurons that were going through my head at that particular point in time. But in that silence of that moment, I kind of found myself watching the moon rise above the ocean, possibly setting above the ocean, because it's the west. Pembrokeshire probably setting, actually, now I think about it. And this question kind of pops into my head: does the moon care? And I kind of sat there and thought about, what's that about? This is a man who's sitting on a beach, freezing cold, and all he can think about is the combination of the moon on the ocean and the book he's trying to write. And those two things came together in this question: does the moon care? But the question stayed with me, and I kept thinking about it. I kept on thinking about it, and I thought, well, if the moon cares, then how does it care? What is it that the moon does that actually could be called care? And the first thing I thought of, well, it's pretty constant in its attention. It's always there, even when we can't see it. It's actually there, but it's not just there. It's actually regulating the tides, for example. It's regulating the entire tidal regime. It's regulating our experience on the planet through the tides. And actually, it was those interstitial ranges, as they're called, between the sea and the land that were so important when our forebears crawled out of the ocean and began to find a way of living on the land. So in other words, the moon was our carer, not just in being there, but actually in looking after the stability of the tidal regime, looking after the interstitial ranges which allowed us to enter, our species, in fact, to evolve. And even more, if you want a kind of climate change analogy, it keeps the Earth at a tilt of around 23 degrees away from the vertical, and that's what keeps the planet in a temperate condition. And if without it, we would wobble mercilessly, and our climate would be all over the place. The moon as a carer is not an altogether silly idea, even though it sort of came to me in a very strange way. But what came out of that for me was that when you think about what the moon is doing, it's bringing us back into balance. It's holding us in balance. It's constantly a kind of restorative force. And when you think about care as a restorative force, then you've suddenly got something to work with. If you think about health, for example, and I don't know if you wanted to come onto this, health and what it means, and in physiological terms, and I've already sort of alluded to this, health is very much about coming back into balance. And we are, as organic beings, we are the lucky recipients of a kind of system of homeostasis which constantly looks out, constant attention to the point of balance, and constantly attempts to restore us to the point of balance. And so as a model, this idea of care as a restoration to the point of balance, it began to really do some work for me. It's not just the moon keeping us in a particular angle in relation to the sun so that we can have a temperate climate. It's not just the interstitial ranges. It's also that actually our health itself is largely regulated by a system of care within our own bodies that's constantly trying to restore that balance to us. And if we could ask the question, what would that mean in our society? What would that mean if care is a fundamental organizing principle in our society, a principle that's constantly trying to restore us to balance rather than lead us away from balance? Then that, I think, is the way in which care as a principle can distinguish for us between these things which claim to be care but which end up in violence, and things which are care in the sense that they maintain and restore our health.
Let's dig into that a little bit, because what was interesting is the way you juxtapose care versus cure, and the way that the modern healthcare system focuses often on cure alone. Not that cure isn't important, but cure is often focused on one specific thing, rather than care of a being and getting them into balance.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important point for me as well, which, again, I kind of stumbled on in the middle. A simple very naive way of thinking about what I was saying is health is prosperity and the economy is care, so let's make everything healthcare as we see healthcare. And then we kind of see, a healthcare system which is actually in disarray at the moment. And it's largely in disarray because the burden of disease has changed massively over the last 50 years. And it's changed from being about, I went back, at one point in writing the book, I managed to visit Tredegar, which is the birthplace of the NHS. And, it was one of those experiences, again, a bit like the moon on the ocean, that kind of woke me up to something quite profound, which was this wonderful vision of universal healthcare free at the point of use. And then looking actually what the healthcare system has become, how the NHS has suffered, and thinking about why it suffered and what's changed. And of course, there's differing political fortunes is one of the things. The NHS has always been a little bit of a political football. But there's also, some even more interesting factors, which is that the burden of this change in the burden of disease. So when the NHS was set up with this vision that Nye Bevan brought to it, that people in an ordinary working town, mining town in Tredegar, should have all the people who were working there should have as much access to healthcare, whatever healthcare they needed. Basically what they were looking at was infectious diseases and workplace accidents. And that was the burden of disease. That was the predominant burden of disease. In the intervening 50 years, our burden of disease has shifted massively. 3/4 of the burden of disease is now attributable to chronic, non-infectious, non-communicable conditions, chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, respiratory diseases of one kind, another, chronic respiratory diseases. And these things now kill most people, more than most, 3/4 of people, and they account for up to 90% of our healthcare bill. And so we're living in a different world. And you wanted me to talk about this distinction between care and cure. And let me say, first of all, that those chronic diseases, I'll just finish this point, those chronic diseases don't have their causes in simple things. And they're not very simple, but they're simpler than the causes of chronic disease, like a germ. If you think of something, like malaria, you can isolate the germ for malaria, and then you can find something which kills it or vaccinates against it. It's a very simple way of thinking about what disease is. And it comes from a time when actually we thought that all disease basically was infectious disease. And so I went back and looked at that time, partly because we're still living within a model of medicine that draws so heavily from that time. And what I discovered was a kind of intense battle that happened for the soul of medicine in around about the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a battle that was between those people who felt that disease was really about a specific germ with a specific cure. If you had that germ, you had that disease. If you had that disease, you could find that germ. If you killed that germ, you would get better from the disease. And it's called germ theory, and a set of postulates, basically, that a German scientist called Robert Koch put together. And what I found, what's interesting was not only that model of disease doesn't quite work for chronic disease that we're now facing, but also that even at the time, there were people who disputed that theory of what makes us ill. And there was a very different theory of what makes us ill, which was called terrain theory, which is about, yes, of course, it matters that you've got a germ in your body, but actually, if you've got a healthy body, you can resist that germ, and the conditions of your body are the terrain. They're part of the terrain. But also the conditions around your body are also the terrain. Do you have clean air? Do you have clean water? Do you have rest? Do you have peace? Do you have quiet? Do you have stress? How much stress do you have? This is all terrain. And we're beginning to relearn, although we forgot it at that critical point in medicine, that actually all of these things matter at least as much as the germ. And the split, and it comes back to your question about cure versus care, is exactly that care is the thing that takes care of the terrain, the conditions, And if you get those conditions right, in fact, and this is an old insight that goes way back to Hippocrates, there is a healing force in your own body, there's a healing force in nature that will restore you to health without intervention other than looking after the conditions, caring for the restoration of that balance. And yet, what medicine did when it saw those conditions was to want constantly to intervene, to cure rather than to care. And those cures were typically pharmaceutical products. And those pharmaceutical products actually, interestingly, also introduce toxins of some kind into your body, so they don't always care for your body. That sometimes that is a necessary thing to do, sometimes it's an important thing to do. But interestingly, the shift of power from a model of health around care to a model of health around cure coincided with the rise of capitalism. Being able to find a drug that hits a germ on the head and gives you something that looks like health was something you could monetize, something you could make a profit from. And so all of a sudden, it's suddenly very profitable to have a model of medicine that is based around cure rather than around care.
And then also there's the capitalism associated with consumerism, and with the way in which we fill our bodies with sugar and with fat, and we don't exercise and we don't live in nature. And you talk a lot about this idea of the care economy as a casualty of the structure of capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, so the first
not so directly because of the pharmaceutical,
because of the pharmaceutical industry, but also, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is great because, you know, if your problem is a disease and the answer is a drug, then you can continually grow the pharmaceutical industry because we've got more and more diseases that we don't know how to handle with lots of symptoms that we have to treat, and that's a lot of money for whoever can come up with the right drug and solve those problems. But what if you're going about it the wrong way? In chronic disease, the terrain matters. In chronic disease, your health is about the conditions under which you live and the absence of those conditions. And so almost all of those diseases that we were talking about, all those chronic diseases, their causes, not their symptoms, but their causes lie in the way that we live, in diet, in nutrition, in the level of stress, in the clean air that we breathe, the access to water that we have, the way that we look after ourselves, and the way that we sleep, for example. All of those things are the causes. When we disrupt those things, they are the causes of ill health. And one of the most striking of those is diet and nutrition. And so a lot of where we've gone wrong and a lot of the rise in chronic disease is attributable actually to the way in which our diets have changed over that period, certainly the 50, 60, 80 years now since Bevan was building the NHS. Massive changes in the way that we eat, massive changes in the food supply system. A lot of that change has to do with blood glucose, as you suggested, with sugar, refined carbohydrates. Those are not things to which our bodies evolved to develop. We have an appetite for sugar, but that appetite for sugar happened because we evolved in an era of absolute scarcity of refined sugar. You could not get refined sugar. You could graze and go out and hunt for a few berries that would give you a little bit of a hit of sugar that was associated also with some fiber, so it was much easier to digest. But you could not go into a patisserie or a delicatessen and see shelf loads of refined carbohydrates and sugar. It wasn't there. That terrain was not there. What was there was scarcity in relation to that. And so we evolved an appetite to search for sugar. And that appetite, and I'm speaking as an addict now, I have to tell you, is addictive. That appetite is an addiction in an environment in which you're surrounded by plenty. And I mean, one of the stories in the book is actually that in the middle of writing all about all this stuff and trying to figure it out, I discovered that I'm pre-diabetic, and then actually even got worse before I got better. But that was not something I expected to find, and it's not something I expected during the writing of the book. But it speaks absolutely to the theme that the terrain matters, that we have an evolved mechanism which is constantly trying to bring us back into balance. And we also have a mechanism which is trying to regulate our dopamine circuits by searching for dopamine. And when we find sugar in abundance, that sugar triggers our dopamine circuits to a point where we become addicted to the sugar even however hard we try, that addictive tendency is going to be there. And so when you look at what's gone wrong in health terms, you come right back to a food industry which is in itself kind of addicted to growth, and which has weaponized our own neuropsychology, our own reward circuits, our own dopamine circuits, to persuade us to eat the most unhealthy food in the world for the long-term health of our bodies, to take us out of balance the whole time. And that's where this dispute between cure and care, between germ theory and terrain theory, really becomes important. You know, there is no germ for diabetes. Diabetes is a condition, certainly type 2 diabetes, is a condition in which the body cannot regulate its own blood glucose. And it can't regulate it in part because it has been subjected to an overindulgence of refined sugars through a diet that has been supported because we believe it will give us growth. And any attempt, in fact, to change that food industry is restricted and opposed on the basis that it will undermine growth.
I have a sense we'll be coming back to those questions later. So let's move on to cover another couple of areas so that we can get a lot of time for audience questions. The David Hume Institute should have known if they were going to ask me to interview you as an Australian that I was going to raise this chapter, which is Fuck the Patriarchy. You talk a lot about the gendered nature of work on the care economy. Can you talk about a bit about that now, and also in particular one woman I'd never heard of, much to my disgust, Nancy Folber, and the invisible heart of society?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, it's a very critical part of the writing of the book for me as well, because very early on, if you're writing about care and you do any of your reading, which you should do, and I'm sure that's some of the things that you told your students, don't write your essays until you've done some reading. You go out and read what other people have said before, and what is true is that most of what's been written about care before has been written by women. And it's been written by women in part because much of what constitutes care and care work has been done by women. And to this day, if you take that sort of narrower definition of care work, healthcare work and social care, 3/4 of that work, paid and unpaid, is done by women. So it's not surprising in a way that it's written about it. But as a man kind of coming into this concept, and I sort of describe it early on, is that, I'm white male economist, mansplains care. I can read the reviews before I've even written the book. It was a little bit of a kind of, well, okay, so what's my position here? And then I became aware of another gender division, which is the gender division with violence. And actually, 90% of armed forces, armed personnel are men still. And most violence is enacted by men, and most violence is enacted by men on women. And some of that violence is state-sanctioned. So it looks like, what is going on here? We have care, which is a fundamental organizing principle for life, and yet somehow we have this thing going on here, violence, which is state-sanctioned, belongs with one half of the population mostly, and not the same half of the population that's looking after care. And you suddenly look at this kind of fractured society and ask yourself kind of what's going on. And there were a couple of people who really helped me, both women, who really helped me kind of sort that out in my head. And one was Nancy Folber, and she has this lovely metaphor, as you said, of the invisible heart. And it goes back, of course, to Adam Smith and the invisible hand. The invisible hand is that kind of force that the market has, which means that everything that's transacted in a free market contributes to the social good. And it does under certain conditions, which took place in Adam Smith's day, but which aren't really quite the case now. That might have some force to it. But what it sort of neglects is that there's a whole other bit of the economy which isn't really transacted in the market, often isn't about market exchange, but actually keeps the whole thing going. It's the heart, actually, that has to pump the blood that allows the invisible hand to function, if you want to take that sort of analogy to that point. So, and that was, one of the things that kind of really was one of the sort of key points that I would keep coming back to, that there's this invisible heart is really something to do with this vision of the economy in a particular way. But then there was a few other points really where I began to think I knew that I would have to look at this gender question, and that chapter, Fuck the Patriarchy, comes quite late on, but my entire writing process, in a way, was writing towards that chapter, because I knew somewhere I would have to confront this sort of idea, particularly coming at it as a man. I would have to confront the idea that, you know, more or less 1/2 of the population does this invisible heart stuff, putting things back together and keeping them well, and the other half goes out and destroys everything. You know, I'm characterizing my own gender here, or stereotyping my own gender, but there is a kind of gender division there. And I began to, it really bothered me, where does this come from? And then, you know, I kind of, the roots into where that goes. I mean, one of them was has anyone seen True Detective, which is a HBO, I think it's HBO or Hulu series or something. And the first one of that has got Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson are these two detectives. And they have this, and they find themselves constantly being led deeper and deeper into a dark sort of mire, where they're the detectives, they're supposed to be on the side of the good, but they're increasingly find themselves drawn to the side of the bad. And then at one point, Woody Harrelson turns to Matthew McConaughey and he says, do you ever think of yourself as a bad man? And Matthew McConaughey kind of thinks about it and he says, the world needs bad men to keep the other bad men away. And it sort of clicked for me that there was something about this gender division, and it's the way that we sort of gender stereotype girls into doing all the nursey apron stuff when they're very small and boys get guns, that actually is something that societally we have fallen into as a kind of a trap, but which has a logic to it. I'm not saying it has a justifiable logic, but it has a logic to it. The world needs bad men to keep the other bad men from the door. And when you look at the way in which we were approaching and glorifying, to some extent, violence in combat, violence in particular situations, the way we're arming whoever wants to have a war against our enemies, this becomes something that is socially deeply ingrained in us, clearly dysfunctional, and nothing to do with care. And so what I really wanted to do with that journey and with that confrontation with the structure of patriarchy was to go even further back and say, where does it come from? And that's when I discovered Sarah Blaffer Hardy, who's an anthropologist, and her, you know, she points actually to patriarchy as being one solution that primates developed in order to secure patrimony. In other words, if you're a guy, to ensure that your kids are your kids and not the offspring of some other dude. And that concept of a hierarchical power that is vested mainly in men and becomes destructive and violent, she traces back to this particular social organization that comes in some primate populations that we, at a certain point in our history, adopted. But she also points out to the fact that it's not the only model, it's not the only way to build a society. It's not the only way, if you have two sexes, for one sex to dominate the other sex. And there's a wonderful woman called Rianne Eisler, who's in her late 90s now, who wrote about this 30, 40 years ago. You could also equally think about a society in which men and women were in partnership with each other rather than in competition, in working together cooperatively rather than becoming one dominating the other. And that this is actually a structural alternative, a way of allowing us to sidestep the trap we fall into when we answer that question, the world needs bad men to keep the other bad men away.
And one of the points you make as well about bringing back to the care versus cure was that care was often the nurses, female nurses at that time, and cure was the physicians, the male physicians.
Yeah, in fact, it kind of came from a war situation. It came from, and this was another really insightful moment for me when I read this, just a very thin pamphlet called Notes on Nursing, written by Florence Nightingale, who really made her name in the Crimea War by going to a field hospital in the Crimean Peninsula and figuring out that actually and the death rate in this hospital, a war hospital from the disastrous Crimean campaign in mid-1850s, The death rate in the war hospital was like something like 40%. You survived the battle, but 40% of people who actually made it to the hospital were dying, and they were dying because the conditions were awful. And so she comes along with some nurses and basically cleans everything up and creates the conditions of care, creates light, clean water, healthy wounds, constant dressing, attention. It was a phenomenal success, and she became phenomenally important in the history of medicine, but she was still sort of subjugated to the power of a medical profession, mainly adopting the principles of surgery and pharmaceutical intervention. So it became the foundation for the nursing profession. But even to this day, you'll see a kind of hierarchy in the medical system where it goes, consultant, registrar, general consultant, GP, nurses, and then ward orderlies, some down. And this hierarchy of medical attention actually is a misrepresentation of the importance of care over cure.
I feel like that is another topic that we might hear from the audience. So I'd like to come on to my last set of questions, if I may. And it's about the question I'm not going to ask you. And what I'm not going to ask you is, what do we do about it? And the reason I'm not going to ask, and I commend the book to you in the final chapter, is because of my favourite quote from your book, which is not yours at all, I'm sorry, but it's Alan Watts.
It's a very good quote. It is
The Wisdom of Insecurity. I'm going to read it out to you. The question, what should we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. If a problem can be solved at all, then to understand it and to know what to do about it are the same thing. I wonder if you could talk about that and about why we don't act as a collective society, but also why we don't act as individuals, even if we care.
Yeah. I mean, I love that quote. I laughed out loud when I heard that quote, partly because I've worked on the interface between research and policy most of my life. And so the idea that I didn't have to offer any policy prescriptions to any policymakers anymore, all I had to do was get them to understand something. And that's not a trivial ask, but it's something different from, can you please come up with a list of policies that we can take to our minister on Monday, and he will sign up to, and it will give us column inches in the newspapers, and everyone will be tweeting about it. That there is a kind of rush towards policy prescription. And to be fair, I did go some way towards providing those who have an appetite for that sort of policy prescription in that final chapter. But it is more than that, and that's kind of what you're suggesting, really, and it's what that Alan Watts quote suggests as well, is that in our rush towards those kind of policy prescriptions, we're actually sometimes falling into the same traps that have caused us to need those policy prescriptions, because we haven't understood those dynamics. So, for example, I mean, there's the dynamic around the gender bias and the patriarchy. That's something we sort of know about, but it isn't about a policy prescription. There are policy things you can say, but it's much, much deeper than that. It's about the fabric of a society that has evolved and developed in such a way that it's created a highly dysfunctional division of labor that is punishing women, men, children, almost everywhere. And until we can sort of see that for what it is and begin to understand where it lives in society, we can't change anything. And likewise, that dynamic that we were describing before of why, well, if I'm caring for myself, if I'm looking after myself, I don't even need this healthcare stuff because I have so much self-care, and that self-care leads me down this path. Yes, I've got to look after my psychological well-being, but my psychological well-being can't be constricted just by, as long as I have a high status, a high reputation, a high power in society, I can have good psychological well-being, particularly when I can only achieve that power by subjugating other people whose well-being is then going to be deeply depressed. It's not a healthy society. It's a society in which the elite and a few people and a minority can achieve not just wealth, but high psychological functioning, so-called high psychological functioning, on the backs of other people, a sort of zero-sum game in which we play at our peril. And I think, when we begin to understand that dynamic itself is dysfunctional because it isn't really self-care when it's all just kind of reputation, status, material power, and ultimately violence. That cannot constitute self-care. Then we have to begin to look elsewhere. We have to begin to look at what some of the fundamental drives towards that towards that need for care are. And one of them is the one that Alan Watts points out, which is this kind of almost existential insecurity, a kind of ultimately, we look up from the labor of looking after ourselves and we see our own mortality and it scares the shit out of us. And that fear drives a lot of what we do in society. It leads us towards this creation of material empire to substitute for the immateriality of our own existence. It leads us to look for durability, to somehow offset the impermanence of our own lives. And so it's a little bit like kind of peeling an onion, I suppose, that you begin to see that what the places where the care economy collapses into the growth economy are deep places in society. They're to do with the gender division of labor and the social structure. They're to do with our own existential anxiety and the way that we approach that. And that's the sense in which I used his quote, really, to sort of say, this is a journey about understanding. It's not a journey about specific policy prescriptions. One of the points I make is that actually, for 30 years, there's a list in there of policy prescriptions which people have talked about for 30 years, and nothing has happened. And that's partly a sort of testament to his idea that, it's not just about what should we do in a narrow sense, it's how should we understand the place that we're in. And we cannot really answer the question, what should we do, until we've kind of gone through that journey.
I think that's a good place to stop and to come to questions from the audience. I think we have microphones that will, and whilst that is being found, I just wanted to ask if anyone here is under 30 or 30 or under. Raise your hands. Okay, I will come to you if you raise your hand to ask a question, because one of the things I find is that sometimes younger people don't want to come forward and ask questions. So you don't have to ask a question, but please do feel welcome to do so. So let's start and see who will raise their hand. Great, at the back here. We'll start there. Up here.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. But my question is with regards to something you asked about what should we not do. I'm going to ask that question. What should we do as businesses, as corporate organizations, to incorporate changes into making, because, corporates are all about growth and building and growing. So how should we incorporate care? There's a lot of well-being focus and, all that. But what are some practical policy prescriptions you would give to a corporate organization in incorporating care into its economic and systematic framework?
Yeah, as I said, there is a kind of long list in the book, which is mainly, I suppose, directed towards governments, but actually has lots of implications for business as well. So, actually looking after the workforce is one of those things that really matters, looking after the conditions of work, looking after the conditions of pay for those particularly working in professions of care and well-being. There's also, I think, a bigger, that's the more obvious way of answering your question in terms of what's there for businesses. But there's also a bigger question, I think, for businesses, which is around what is it that your business is doing in society? Is it contributing to that sense of care in the sense of bringing people into balance, bringing health, bringing society itself into balance, or is it driving it away from us? And I think, that's a question that I've, even right back when I was writing Prosperity Without Growth, I've always wanted businesses to ask. And when I go into businesses, it's always one of the questions that I ask, first of all, what is your product? Is it a thing that you have to dig materials up in the ground, fabricate, sell to as many people as fast as you can and hope they throw it away quickly so you can rinse and repeat? Or is it actually a service that you're providing for society? And if it's a service, what is that service? And that service has a lot to do with those activities that I call the Cinderella economy, the care, craft, creativity, that improves our quality of life, that treads lightly on the planet because it isn't about proliferation of material stuff. And that creates a different kind of business model. And that business model is also not trivial. You have to figure out how you can maintain your own viability as a business within that. And sometimes that means you also have to question the profit motive within that business as well, and ask whether you should be a profit company or a not-for-profit company, and what the conditions of that profit should be, and how much you give to your dividend holders, how much you distribute dividends to your shareholders. All of that, really, how you operate as a business, all of it can be looked at through the lens of care. And doing that, I think, it's not a trivial task, but I think it's one that each business has to do for itself.
On a more micro level, at that, do you know the book by Andre Spicer and someone else? I think it's called The Wellbeing Syndrome. Am I right there? Is that right?
I have seen a book called The Wellbeing Syndrome.
Right, this is it. And their idea is that what's happening is that companies are pushing onto individuals this responsibility for well-being. So we'll buy you a Fitbit so you can check your steps. And if you don't do enough steps, that's your fault. You know, it's not our fault because we're a company who make you sit at your desk all day and chained to your desk. It's your fault because you didn't do your steps. And in fact, now we've got the data that it's your fault, okay? Et cetera, okay? And actually, it's a really interesting idea of the fact that companies are pushing onto individuals what they themselves are causing. Very worth reading.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. But I mean, if you take the model of the food industry, for example, as a case in point, you know, if you're a company in the food industry, what is your food doing? Is it really creating health, or is it creating ill health? Is it creating ilth? And although you can't monetize everything, there are some products which are incredibly useful, incredibly interesting when it comes to getting back to health. And there is definitely a business model in creating the markets, creating the opportunities for those products. The danger comes, I think, where you lose sight of that balance of health. And actually, I mean, I would even say, so I have on my arm, I have a continuous blood glucose monitor, and somebody sold that to me. But it actually revolutionized my life. So it's not like there's nothing you can do in that economy. If you're selling everybody blood glucose monitors, even when they don't need it, and you're making them buy it at furious expense, and you're creating huge profits because the entire society is full of chronic disease, that's the point where it goes wrong. But the idea that you have companies who are providing products and services that contribute to health, I think, is absolutely central. It's still a need.
And it's the idea that capitalism per se isn't wrong when it's run sustainably and run in a way that's not... oh, there's a hesitation.
You saw the hesitation. Yeah. No ifs, no buts.
Because you do touch on, but I wanted to get to your...
I'm not sure about that.
You touch on capitalism
at
the start, and about the idea that is it even possible to run capitalism in this way?
Could you run capitalism differently? I think the problem with capitalism, and it is a big problem, is that capitalism runs on the accumulation of wealth. Accumulation of wealth runs from the maximization of profit. The maximization of profit tends to override concerns of health. And we see it over and over again. So there's one story I tell in the book that goes back to the middle of the 19th century, where people turn up in Llandrindod Wells in Wales for the water cure. And people literally drowned because they were being sold water cures that were literally drowning them, or being sold waters that were so offensive, actually, that they undermined their health. So people, and you see it in the opioid crisis. You know, it's a pharmaceutical industry that has maximized profit through the production of pharmaceuticals, opioid prescriptions, prescription drugs that are now running rampant on the streets of San Francisco as fentanyl. And this is the danger within capitalism. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but I'm saying it's a force within capitalism that makes care very difficult to maintain.
So I think the key issue there is maximising profit versus making a profit, and that's an ideological issue. But we could debate forever, and I'm not meant to be doing that. So we have a question here first, and then behind you after that.
Desperately trying to formulate a question.
Yes, do.
You seem to indicate that caring for self isn't care if it's at the expense of others. That's what I took from the sort of the self-care element. But if you look back at human history, I suppose, way back, isn't some sort of inherent selfishness for kith and kin in a resource-limited terrain part of us as well. So how do you square those elements of caring versus inherent sort of self-interest in a way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think in a way one of the things I'm saying is that selfish instinct, that self-preservation, and actually I talk about this in both the previous books. I talk about it less in the care economy, interestingly, but is well documented in psychology, and it's also well documented that it isn't the only force. There's also a kind of altruistic force. So, and in fact, there's a psychologist called Shalom Schwartz who has something called the Schwartz Values Scale, which says that you have these poles in the human psyche. So selfishness here, altruism here, as a kind of scale, and we're continually torn between that sort of tension. And then he has another one which is about novelty-seeking behavior here and tradition here, and this is a kind of orthogonal tension. And that actually what we're doing in society, or this is my argument rather than his, that what we're doing in society is we're prioritizing novelty-seeking selfishness. And that's what capitalism tends to do very well, and the structure of our society does very well. And it's not to say that we should all just suddenly be saint-like altruists looking out for everyone, but that actually we should think about that kind of sphere of the tensions between us. And I think that's a place where you don't have to say, it's not about the idea that you can't have self-care. It's about what can that self-care mean? What is the health? What is the psychological health that we could be aiming for? And in particular, what's the psychological health that we could be aiming for which didn't mean high levels of psychological functioning for a minority who can afford it, and tragedy for the rest of the population who are the victims of that? And so it's a way, I mean, I do think there's also a kind of, if you're brought up in the Christian Gospels as I was, there's also a way of thinking about it as an appeal to the second commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. And I don't know if anyone saw recently this spat between Rory Stewart and J.D. Vance about, what Christ's commandment was in terms of loving your neighbor. And J.D. Vance's view was basically it's concentric circles of close selfishness from the inside out. And Rory Stewart said that's not what was being said. In fact, the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the former Pope's favorite parables was precisely that your neighbor is everyone. Your neighbor is the people that you might reject. Your neighbor is those you regard as enemies. Your neighbor is not this close concentric circle. And so in a sense, and I think the book is kind of reaching for this in a way, it's reaching for a view of psychological well-being which goes beyond that sort of high focus on the middle of that concentric circle and towards a sense of psychological well-being which is relational, which we could be said to be well because we're concerned with the well-being of those around us rather than just the tight circle.
Question here, and then we're going to come to the back row afterwards, okay, into the middle. But we'll start here.
Thank you.
If you could start getting the microphone down there, because it's
absolutely loved your point about capitalism and Adam Smith, which we could talk about for hours. And you've also shocked me about the sugar industry, because it reminds me that we don't understand that the Tate Modern Gallery is funded by Tate and Lyle for a very good reason, is that it perpetuates that sugar addiction. But anyway, your point about policy prescription and balance and what is the economy for? The economy should be for our well-being. The economy can't function without our well-being. I saw today they reckon that the cuts to benefits that have been announced is going to cost the economy £38 billion. How is it, do you think, that civil servants and politicians don't understand the very point you're making?
Yeah, I ask myself that question almost every day. I do think one of the reasons they don't understand it is because they live inside the growth-based model of what the economy should be. And so you justify support of an industry, even when the evidence shows that it's causing us harm, because it contributes to the GDP, because it creates profit, it creates value. And a part of the model is this, that we don't believe we can afford care until we have profits. So until we have all these profits, which we can then tax, and incomes that we can then tax, and that creates government revenues, then we can afford your lovely care-based system. And it's so profoundly the wrong way around, because then you end up making decisions like that, taking away things which actually then mean you have what Herman Daly would call uneconomic growth. And so you have uneconomic growth in the healthcare system, you have uneconomic growth in your welfare system, you have, by trying to create growth, you actually have ILF, you have exactly the opposite of and it's what I've called the false economy before, and I think it's something that I fundamentally would love to see inside the Treasury, some sensible discussion of this, because it's not in the book, but in the aftermath of the book, I wanted to quantify some of this health-related costs of the food industry. And I did a piece of work for the Food Farming Countryside Commission last year, end of last year, called The False Economy of Big Food, where I put the numbers together. And it's extraordinary. It's £268 billion is the cost of our eating the wrong kind of food in the wrong kind of way. And that's a real cost to the exchequer. It's health costs, it's social care costs, it's welfare spending costs, it's the loss of our quality of life, it's our shortened lives. And that becomes a loss, a real economic loss to the economy, to society. And yet the costs of putting that right would be a fraction of what is being lost. If we could just let go of that idea that we have to support any industry that claims that it's creating economic growth.
In the middle at the back, I think there are two questions. If they're related, why don't we have them both together, and then we'll get Tim to answer. It doesn't matter if they're related, we're going to have them both anyway.
Thanks for the talk. I liked your analogy of the house and how, looking at our health as a house, you have to put investment into it to take care of it. And, as with what you said about balance, it's important to have a balance between things. There's now also this movement which goes the other way, where there's like this general understanding that this house at some point is...
Can you speak a bit louder? Hold
Sorry, yeah, this house at some point is going to fall apart, and that's just aging, right? But now there's this movement where we want to keep that house for a little longer and a little longer. And how do you think that sort of fits into this view of the care economy, where we want to extend lifespan and we want to, live for 200, 300 years?
Okay, that's a big question, Tim. Think about that one.
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, I'm going to have
So
to
if you're kind of saying, if your analogy is the house and you want to keep the house going for as long as possible so it doesn't fall down, isn't there an analogous process with the human being? You want to keep lifespan going for as long, and there is that kind of movement. You're absolutely right. So I'll come to that question. Do you want to take the other one anyway?
Yes, let's take that.
Also I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm a philosophy student at the University of Edinburgh. And I think about care quite a bit in terms of feminist care ethics and things. And so I was kind of wondering your thoughts about how we can prevent sort of the co-option of care, or sort of how can we, is it that through this kind of multi-axis or multi-dimensional framing of care, we prevent a co-option of it by capitalism or other features, or, just about that kind of topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really interesting. So this idea that, and it is very popular, that you should keep people going for as long as possible, and that you can, that you can extend lifespan, which is kind of what you're asking about, isn't it? I mean, in a sense, the fundamental point is that everything put together sooner or later falls apart, which is a line from Paul Simon and Garfunkel fame. But it's something that I always kind of come back to, because everything material sooner or later falls apart. So even that house eventually is going to fall apart. And definitely our physical bodies age, and they have aging processes. Is it something legitimate to engage in to try and extend that? I think it's definitely something legitimate, and it's kind of core to the argument in a way, to extend your chances of a decent quality of life, because most of what people are doing at the moment actually is not about their life extension. It's actually about the morbidity, what's called morbidity. So the quality of life towards the end of their life begins to deteriorate in ways which are the result of these chronic diseases that we bring along with us. So in some sense, that desire for a kind of almost eternal life as a human being is aligned with this idea of an improvement of health. And actually, the more that you improve health, the less that you create morbidity, because you've got less chronic disease, the chances are that people will begin to live longer, and your populations, you will have greater population health, and you will have greater life expectancy if you're focusing on that. What point does that turn into a kind of what I see as a slightly obsessive drive for a very, very long life, radical changes in the way that we live? And I think there's nothing wrong with that in itself, except two things. One is that it can become a sort of substitute for thinking about our own mortality, that eventually, even those very, very long lives are almost certainly going to end. The idea of human immortality is a long way away. And therefore, coming to terms with that mortality still rests as a kind of individual and social task that we have to engage in. And the second thing that's wrong with it, and this is only wrong if it happens, is that pursuit is generally only available to the richest in society. And the conditions under which it's available to the richest in society could well be undermining health for the poorest in society. And that's the point, I think, where it kind of goes wrong. To come to the point about how can we stop care being co-opted, I mean, I guess in a way that was why I wanted to create this idea of care as an organizing principle, as a specific principle that is dedicated towards restoring balance. And that's and if you have that, this is my sort of answer to your question, if you have that, then you can look at any specific action and ask to what extent is that action really care, by asking whether it restores balance. So let's take a worldwide example. If one of your friends engages in a war, would it be better to act as a mediator in that conflict, or to send them bombs to drop on their enemy? One of those brings it back into balance. Dialogue brings diplomacy back into balance. The other one pushes it towards violence. Violence begets violence. Rage begets rage. And that pushes constantly things out of balance. Whereas that act of acting as a mediator and being in a diplomatic relationship is an attempt to pull things back into balance. Now, there's obviously always limits to that sort of occasion, and limits have to be looked at very clearly in every circumstance. But it's an example of applying that idea that care is a lens through which we can look at the actions and ask, is this restorative of balance? Is it restorative of health? And another, kind of simpler example, I suppose, in a way, is to say, what do you do when someone's got sugar craving? Or what do you do when someone's addicted to opioid prescription drugs? When is it care to give those people more prescription drugs? And when is it care to find the balance, the rebalancing mechanism that will allow their own body to restore that person to health? And that's, it's not a kind of policy prescription as an answer to your question, but it's a way of how you would use that concept in different circumstances to think about how care is being co-opted, to say, actually, this is not care, that's not care, but this is restoring balance. It is a movement towards health, and is legitimately something that we can call care. And I think, to me, it was partly seeing that co-option of the word care by all sorts of people that made me realize that you need something like that to stop it happening.
We've got one question here. Where is that? Where are we, Susan? Here. And then in front of you, this man has been very focused, so I'd love to get your question as well. Can we do those two? Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, did you come across in your research any countries or communities that you feel are further ahead in kind of implementing these kind of principles, or have these principles more at their heart?
So the question was, any countries and communities who are further ahead in these principles? And then we'll take the other question as well.
There's one right in the middle. Do you want to take this as well at the same time, Marcus Jones?
No, we'll take this one and then we'll come to the one in the middle. So if you could find who's in the middle? Susan? Leslie, okay. Pass along to Leslie and then we'll come down the front afterwards. And I think that might end up us. So let's see how we go. Sorry, John.
Thank you.
So we're doing 3 altogether.
No, we're going to do 2 and then 2.
Okay, cool.
I think 2 is enough to keep in your mind.
Yeah.
Thank you for an excellent contribution. You emphasised the massive change from the time when the NHS was founded in the middle of the 1940s. And yet, our politicians and policymakers are still, say they are, and seem to still be committed to the founding principles, including free provision at the point of need. To what extent do we need to depart from, or at least rethink, these founding principles, given all that you've set out? And if so, or perhaps in any event, how can we help our politicians and policymakers to have the courage to think differently, to think, if you like, through the lens through which you've shared your views tonight?
Yeah, both interesting questions. I mean, I think, one of the countries that I went to first of all when I was looking at was Cuba, because Cuba created a healthcare system that became more or less the envy of the world. They did it in a very particular way under very particular conditions. And some of that emerged actually when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, and Cuba had been supported by the Soviet Union for all sorts of nefarious political reasons for quite a long time. And when that was no longer there, they kind of had to look for themselves. And what they began to look at was, how can we really institute a concept of health, and what would it look like, and how we look after people's health. And that meant actually in Cuba also looking after diets and looking after what the food was like there. So it was an early example, a very simple early example of a country which did that better. Typically speaking, I would say that Latin American economies generally, the kinds of things that I'm talking about are much more prevalent in the kind of ordinary politics of Latin American countries, even though those politics are very convoluted as well. And when you look at the statistic, it kind of shows up that actually life expectancy in Latin American economies can be higher than in some Western economies. So Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile, for example, have a higher life expectancy than the US does, even though their income is only a fraction of what the average income is in the US. So that's a quite good sort of place to look for examples. And then the other one is Scandinavia, because Scandinavia has a kind of concept of the welfare system and the welfare economy, the welfare state that is a kind of stronger, possibly even, than the one that we developed here in the UK. And certainly, I mean, what I've found talking about this stuff is that it's been received quite in a way that I had never anticipated, never had before in a country like Denmark, for example, and they have there a kind of debate about care that sort of mirrors some of what I've been saying in the book and looking at in the research. So various examples in different places. There are also indigenous examples as well. So some of the concepts that you can find in indigenous tribes in other places, that's probably also worth saying. So your question really was about what can we do to persuade, are those values, is the model itself still relevant kind of 80 years later, almost 80 years later? And how can we persuade politicians to think again? See, when I look at what Bevan had in mind, what that vision to me was universal healthcare, free at the point of need for anyone who needed it, that ability to provide healthcare. And I think that is a principle which is well supported by the Declaration of Human Rights, for example. It's supported by the ideas of a civilized society. It's supported by religious commandments like the ones that I was talking about from the New Testament. It's supported by other religions as well in different ways. That idea that healthcare and looking after people's health, it matters. That, I'm sure, is what motivated Bevan. He had a hard time creating what the NHS became out of that. And some of the seeds of where it went wrong were written into that initial setting up of the NHS. For example, that the only way you could really bring the British Medical Association on board was to allow the doctors to maintain private practice. And you can see that, although it was a totally strategic necessity at the time, it is a way in which that kind of two-tier health system that we're shifting towards was already there in the seeds of what we were looking at. And then the other thing, of course, which I've mentioned before, is that we're looking at a very different world. You know, what's needed in order to be care is much more in the realm of primary care and care in the community than was set up through the NHS model. So the NHS funding, for example, is less than 10% of NHS funding goes towards prevention. And there is now a recognition in Wes Streeting and the Department of Health in this renovation of our view of the economy that we do have to do something better there. We have to have something that's more geared towards prevention, because we can't afford the cure for all the conditions that come from these chronic diseases. But they kind of need to go a little step further and not kind of get in bed with Eli Lilly, because Eli Lilly has come here promising an investment in Manchester, which will put the entire overweight population of Manchester on Wanjaru, or whatever Eli Lilly's anti-obesity drug is, and will cost the UK taxpayer trillions of pounds. You know, there's a mismatch somewhere in people's heads that they sort of get, yeah, we have to pay attention to pay lip service to the idea of prevention. So let's think about prevention. There's masses of really, really good local GPs, health professionals thinking about prevention with no resources at all to do it. And so actually kind of getting that message into the Department of Health and getting that out there, I think is really, really important. And getting this dumb idea that if, you know, as long as we have a bargain with Eli Lilly, who's laughing all the way to the bank, and Keir Starmer can stand on a platform and announce that the new UK government is open for business, that will solve our health problems, is almost laughable when you kind of describe it the way I have. But it's also deep in the mindset that has to be shifted.
So we're running so low on time. We've got Leslie here, and then Susan, I promised a question here. A quick one. So Leslie, it has to be quick.
Okay.
Susan, the question here has
Very
to be quick.
quick.
And then Tim, you're under instruction for a quick answer.
Quick answers.
Okay, Leslie, start.
Okay, Leslie Martin. Yep. Well, I was really taken. Thank you so much for all those interesting ideas. I'll never look at the moon in the same way again. But really, I want to ask you, I'm a government practitioner. Obviously, I laughed at the policy prescriptions. And you've wrestled with the idea of care. And we are thinking now, what do we mean by care? And my question really comes down to this idea about the reflective practitioner. You know, in government, we want certainty and we want policy prescriptions. So does an ethic of care then perhaps embrace more acceptance of uncertainty and not knowing, and maybe things changing, and always a kind of struggle for meaning going on? It's a tough gig for politicians to accept uncertainty and not knowing everything. But can we do it? And does it fit within an ethic of care, you think?
Okay, thank you, Leslie. And
Hi, Tim. William from Scotonomics. I'm a huge fan of yours. I'm also an ecological economist, but I thought I'd ask you a more difficult question. At the start of the framing, you said that we need to think about health much more in financialised terms. So for me, you said about assets and financing and refinancing, and I think one of the dangers we have in our economic system and framework is that we're looking at natural capital, our environment, and we're financialising it. And I'm just wondering if you could justify this idea that we take that deeply harmful effect on our ecology into the idea of health.
Yeah, let me come to that one first, because I didn't quite mean that we have to financialise health. Actually, what I meant was the opposite, was that we have to healthise finance. So we have to take the principles of health and apply them to our economy, rather than we have to take the principles of finance and apply them to health. And nonetheless, I was making a very pragmatic point that if you think about health as an investment, in the metaphorical sense, then you would think about the thing that you need to finance as something that you could amortize over a length of time. I'm not saying how much it should be. I'm not saying you should monetize health. I'm simply saying it's like that. It's like if you've got a house, you have to maintain it. And the same thing is true of health. And those investment costs that you put into the maintenance of the house, as it happens, you could account for differently, and that would make it easier to pay them. So that was kind of what I was saying. But I do accept that argument, and I'm not a fan of the, you know, as long as we monetize nature, it will solve all our problems. Like you, I'm skeptical of that.
Uncertainty for politicians.
Yeah. I mean, it is a very difficult thing for politicians to embrace uncertainty, and that's a kind of message along a journey to understanding how we can make care work, but it's not the only policy message. So there are much more direct, pragmatic policy messages, I think. I mean, I do agree with your idea that a care ethic matters, and that having that care ethic in the way that care is delivered matters. And I think it also leads you towards certain kinds of ways of acting and away from other ways of acting. And I'm not sure which bit of which care sector you work where do you work in? Economic development in the Department of Health?
Not anymore, but I worked in the council.
In the council?
I've done strategies
right.
All about certainty.
Yeah.
Knowing what to do.
But on the other hand, we've got different kinds of certainty. So we've got a certainty that's built in the lab around the impact of a drug on a germ. And then we've got a certainty that comes from our public health science, which says that population health depends on certain parameters, like the quality of housing, the quality of air, access to good work, sense of meaning and purpose. And those are things that you can think of if you're thinking through this lens. Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, but these are specific points of intervention in which you can create not certainty itself, but you can create the statistical likelihood of better outcomes. And we know a lot about that. We know, the evidence base for that is now huge. The evidence base around what we were talking about, blood glucose, is huge. The evidence base for the impact the food industry having is huge. The evidence base for, clean air is massive in terms of our public health. And yet we continue to prioritize, traffic schemes and the absence of low emission zones and the building up of environments because they're promising growth. And so if it seems to me that if you're in kind of economic development, looking at it through these lens, yes, you can go down my route of thinking that ultimately it's all about our existential anxiety, but I'm not sure that that's going to help your day-to-day job. And that's why I think that's not all the book does. It comes back to what are very, very pragmatic ways of using this specific lens to think about your outcome goals. And that, I think, is a partly philosophical task, but it's also incredibly pragmatic.
I'm afraid that we've got no more time for questions. Before Susan jumps up to speak from the David Hume Institute, I wanted to thank you, Tim, for the robust discussion and for the book, and in particular for the laughs I got from the book, which I did, mostly at the expense of economists.
Right.
Some very nice jibes in there if you would like to read about those. But also for the clear way in which you tackle things and then sort of refuse to tackle things as well. This issue in the final chapter of saying, have you understood it? Because if you have, you know the solutions. And really kind of embracing and making us push back instead of wanting, what the publisher probably wanted, which was a checklist at the end. About, okay, what do we do? And that's the problem with a lot of what happens is we sort of jump to what do we do, but we don't do it.
Yeah.
So what's the point of knowing what to do if you don't do it?
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know
there is a checklist, 2 checklists, for those who need them. Yeah.
Where's the checklist?
In the final chapter.
He mentioned them at the beginning.
I read the final chapter. I'm
Chapter
flicking.
15, the red pill.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I have no checklist.
Oh, come on. Maybe they took them out. Maybe the publisher took them out. I had this dream last night that I dreamt. There you go, checklist.
Oh, that's
checklist
the list.
1,
that's a list of policies.
Checklist 2.
Yeah, that's a good list.
Oh.
It's not a checklist. There are no boxes for me to tick.
Oh, sorry. There's no checklist in this book. I'm sorry.
Susan, over to you.
I think that is a good point to intervene. For those of you who have not met yet, my name is Susan Murray and I'm director of the David Hume Institute. I feel like I want to go and sit on that beach that you were talking about and look at the moon and just think about everything you filled our brains with tonight, because there is so much food for thought. So I'm sad to bring this conversation to a close, but I'm really aware of everyone's well-being, and it is a beautiful sunny evening. So instead of looking at the moon, maybe you'll go and bathe in some sunlight and think about what you've heard tonight. So much food for thought about our economy and society, which is exactly what the David Hume Institute is all about. I'd like to thank you, Tim, for coming all the way to Scotland and sharing your latest thinking. And the wonderful Sarah Ivory, I love seeing you chair things. You are fantastic and humorous, and thank you for bringing the laughs to what is a serious subject that we all need to take away and think about how we're going to change things, including I do think about my own addiction to sugar every time I hear you speak, Tim, and I don't fix it, I'm afraid. I'd also like to thank our fabulous partners. It is wonderful to work with the team at the EICC, and you as the audience are our partners too, because you make every event and you make every conversation so insightful by bringing your own expertise. So Tim's book is on sale outside, and he does have a few moments to sign some of them, but he cannot stay for long because he's hot-footing it up the road. There is a QR code on the screen. I have a button to press, which I've not pressed. Oh, it's already there. Fantastic. You're amazing, team. I said you were amazing. So please do let us know your thoughts and feedback on tonight. The David Hume Institute is a charity, and we are entirely funded by individuals and organisations to deliver research and events. Sarah, when she was talking about the transfer of risk between individuals and organisations, made me think about our work on the Great Risk Transfer. So if there is anyone in the audience that's not read that, have a look at that, because I think it's all connected to this, and that's a different lens to think about the Great Risk Transfer. Without you, the audience, and all our supporters, we would not exist. So please speak to me afterwards if you don't already support us and you'd like to start. Thanks for joining us all tonight. Our next event will be a breakfast briefing on Tuesday, the 27th of May, where we will release the latest Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. And there are loads of results coming in that relate to this conversation tonight. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.